Welcome to the Water People podcast. I'm Lauren Hill and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. Today, we're in conversation with Sachi Cunningham, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, photographer, journalist, and professor of multimedia journalism at San Francisco State University. Sachi recently released the film Crutch, which chronicles the gravity-defying life of Bill Shannon, an internationally renowned artist, breakdancer, and skate punk on crutches. When not making documentaries, Sachi can be found swimming the heavy water of Northern California, where she's known for documenting big waves and the women who ride them. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. I realized that we needed to invite Sachi to be on the podcast after reading a story that she wrote for Surfing World magazine here in Australia. And it wasn't even really the content of her article that struck me, but it was the fact that I just felt like I should know more about her, considering the scope and breadth of her work and the role that she's played in the shift of surf culture toward recognizing gender pay equity. Basically, my thought was, why don't we all know about this incredibly accomplished, Emmy-winning, Ivy League-educated photographer and filmmaker who's amongst only a really small handful of people to shoot from the water somewhere like mavericks in the icy waters of Northern California?
It is actually a strange world that Sachi belongs to. The surf photographer community is renowned for being very eclectic and pretty much all men. Yeah. It's just been that way for so long, and it is so wonderful to have so many women shooting surf and water photos these days and moving images, and doing so in locations that have primarily been boys' clubs, big waves. And not only are those women there shooting pictures, but they're shooting pictures of women surfing. And so there's a change in the lineup and in the channel that is really welcome and really overdue, and I think really interesting that she would have a unique perspective. The images would be different. Her interpretation of that space would be different. And what is interesting is it's not that she's a woman that is interesting to me. It's that she's there as one of very few women in that space. And so there's like a perspective that she could share. There is an experience that's just so different. It just feels like the big wave surfing world has been on repeat for so long, like a loop, a cycle of just sort of macho stories, overcoming, conquering, all this very militant macho language. And what is interesting is that there's a lot of surfers now, big wave surfers, men and women, who aren't like that. They're very softly spoken, very articulate, very sweet.
Very calculated.
Very calculated, yeah. Really clever when it comes to taking measured risks and all of that. And there's women in the mix too now. And it's just all round, I think, a much healthier space than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that your point about being, an other in a kind of homogenous culture of, having a rather different life experience and different perspective on, say, big wave surfing and being amongst the mix of people in that world is interesting. And I came across some research about psychological adaptations that are more common in women when responding to fear. And there was a study in the year 2000 that really counters our cultural understanding that fight or flight happens to be our only natural response to stressful stimuli. This researcher, Dr. Shelley Taylor, made known that psychologists had really only ever tested people who happened to be men in their foundational studies of fear response. And in her work, Dr. Taylor concludes that women tend to respond differently than men do in similarly threatening situations, and that women in particular tend to respond by tending to children and elderly, making sure they're safe, and seeking out connection and camaraderie to ensure mutual safety. And this approach is called the tend and befriend adaptation, which I think is just a fascinating reflection on how differently paradigms can look when we take into consideration multiple viewpoints on the same ideas.
It's definitely wonderful in the big wave arena now that there is a tend and befriend atmosphere actually emerging, and you see that in the form of multiple jet ski safety teams, and that's people who are both men and women who are on skis purely there to look out for surfers in the lineup and other surfers looking out for each other. And that's come because there have been serious injury and loss of life in that area of surfing. And that's really wonderful. And then I always think that there is so much learning, there is so much teaching in the experience of heavy water. And that can be applied to life on land, and that Sachi really does that well. And I really love hearing from her in relation to how it feels being submerged in big dark waves, and how she draws on that for other aspects of well-being and life.
Yeah, we speak a bit about Sachi's family history, and specifically about Sachi's mom's upbringing in a Japanese-American internment camp. The camps were reactionary policy by the U.S. government after the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor on Oahu. So from 1942 to 1945, the U.S. government mandated the incarceration of all people of Japanese descent. It seems impossible and just unthinkable, really, in terms of violating civil rights. But all people of Japanese descent, including U.S. citizens, were incarcerated in isolated camps with the intention of preventing espionage on American shores. More than 120,000 people's lives, the majority of whom were American citizens, were derailed for years. And Sachi's mother was born into one of the camps where she lived for the first 4 years of her life. Learning this about Sachi, I was just really interested in the way that cultures of silence, including the oppressive silencing of Japanese Americans in the U.S., but also the Japanese cultural tradition of using silence as a strategy for avoiding conflict. I was interested to know how that has influenced Sachi's incredible storytelling and also her drive to dabble in a variety of mediums.
Yeah, she's definitely not staying silent.
No.
And that's so wonderful. The world's a better place because of that. So, a lot to learn from, and like a lineage of overcoming, which is really wonderful in her story.
We begin these conversations in the same place by asking about a time or experience after which you were never the same. Do you have a time like that you'd be willing to share with us, Sachi?
I do. So I actually had two prepared that were very related to my water photography. The first time I swam out in a barrel at Lakey Peak in 1997, and it was Sean from North Narrabeen was coming down the line, and I was going up, and it was like, everything was electric, and I knew I was going to do water photography from that point on. And then the first time I went out at a big day at Ocean Beach with my camera, but I'm not going to tell the stories because I was listening to some of your podcasts, and Taylor Steele, at the end talked about vulnerability and the value of that. And I very much value that. And then I listened to Mary Setterholm, who's just like, woof. I actually did a video with her when I was at the LA Times, just a short video about the surf bus. And I don't think she was telling that story. She alluded to it, but I don't think she was telling it yet. So it was so nice and powerful, obviously, and horrific and just anyhow. So I'm not going to do the easy route. I'm going to give you a worldwide exclusive. Truly, I've never told this story before. This is the story, though. I knew it in the moment, but I was trying to figure out why that moment was a moment where I was never the same. So that moment was at Western Psychiatric Hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I was staring into a mirror, and I had just gotten out of a month in a rubber-walled room. And I was out because the medication that they were giving me all these different medications. And I ended up having what's called an NMS syndrome. I wrote it down because I had neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And your organs kind of start shutting down. You get a high fever and you get really stiff muscles. And I guess it's 1 in 10,000 people it happens with who take psychiatric drugs. So because of this, they just took me off of everything. They took me off of all of the medications, and they took me out of the rubber-walled room. And I remember I was basically kind of in a coma for a few days. And when I came to consciousness, they had just given me a shower. And it was also, I think, the first shower I'd haven't had in a really long time. So, I was clean. I was still in my scrubs, but they gave me a comb to brush my hair. Like, I combed my hair, and I was looking in the mirror, and I just remember just kind of seeing just this glimmer of me that had returned. And what was different is this was my second time in a rubber-walled room. It was my second time being hospitalized. And the first time was when I was in college, my sophomore year. And it's a longer story leading up to what brought me there. But in part, it was, my mom. What triggered it all is that my mom died when I was a junior in college. She had ovarian cancer. But she was diagnosed when I was in high school. And I kind of just pushed forward. Like, my whole life was spent trying to just get into the best college I could. That was kind of my whole life was devoted to getting into the best college that I could. That was my escape. That was my ticket out and into a world of my own design. Mm-hmm. But when she got sick, we kind of didn't even really skip a beat. We never really talked about it. She just really wanted me to carry on. And I did. And so I know now that I bottled up a whole lot of feelings and trauma over that, but I carried on. And then sophomore year is when I had this psychiatric break, and I went to a rubber-walled room, but that time was only, I think, for a week. I think I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I was back in school. I was back on the swim team. I was back in swim practice, and it was like I was back. I just carried on, just plowing forward, But this time it was my first semester of my senior year. I was about to graduate, and it was like, and here I was in this psychiatric hospital, just stripped to nothing and just barely even being able to see myself. But in this moment, I saw myself. I think a little glimmer, little bit of hope that I could hold on to. I think an analogy I thought of was, have you guys seen the series Away with Hilary Swank, where she goes to Mars?
No.
It's a mission to Mars. It's great. And there's a botanist on board, and they try to see if they can grow things in space, and then they lose the water, and the captain ends up, I won't tell you everything, but the captain ends up not drinking her own water so that she can secretly keep this one sprout green and growing, and I think that's kind of what I saw. It's just like this little sprout of this new me. And it's not like I'm going to be a water photographer and world traveler. It's not like it was like the new me I saw at all. I didn't know who that new me was, but it was just like, shit, like, your mom's gone. you're not going to graduate from college this, next semester. That saying that God laughs at your plans was just, he had just had this, time with me. And I just finally was surrendering to that reality and surrendering to it, but also knowing that like something in me was there, that I was going to be able to, find that person that would get me back. And it was certainly going to be a new person, and I didn't know who that, I didn't know what that path was going to be at all. But I guess it was just a moment where I knew it wasn't going to be the path that I had previously thought. And to bring it to the surfing is that I just think once, and at that point I didn't surf. I was a body surfer, but I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is like there's rivers, but there's no ocean. But my parents are from Southern California, and my dad's family used to rent a beach house in Capistrano Beach. And that's so 2 weeks every year I was in the ocean, but that's really it. And then I was a swimmer in chlorinated indoor pools. But, I eventually got myself to the ocean. And I think why the ocean was so powerful and has really been the guiding force of my life since then is, as you know, it's just this, it is life. It is energy. It just like fills you up with what you're meant to do, I guess, or carry. That I saw this interview or heard an interview, I don't remember where it was from, but with Mark Healy, and he was talking about big wave surfers and how he's like, have you seen their eyes? I mean, have you ever noticed that they just have the like most intense sparkling eyes? And he's like, it's because it's the energy, right? The energy just like goes into you. And I do believe that. I was listening to your Susan Casey interview and her book about the ocean. And I was like, of course, like the ocean is life. That's why our womb is modeled after it, right? It is life. And the ocean, it's just been a portal into this endless well of energy and creativity. And the water photography, I think, is, and body surfing. Body surfing was my entry into surfing. And, those things specifically, I think you're just really feeling the energy, right? You're not on top of it. It's moving through you. And so I think that is what I need. I thrive on it.
Well, thank you for sharing, Sachi. I was curious about the little sprout moment. And as anyone who's grown a plant or a garden or anything to do with the ecology of the world knows that a sprout is there, but very vulnerable still. And that little seedlings actually thrive when there's a bit of wind to knock them around, some sunlight to warm them up, and some water and some support, some loving support. So when you were that little sprout that you spotted among a challenging period, what came next? What was that next stage? What was your sunlight and your support after that?
I love that, the wind analogy. I do also remember my neck I was the thinnest I've ever been because I couldn't eat. I just didn't eat during that. So my neck was just like, it looked like my head was going to fall off my neck. I've never really seen it like that before. So what was my support was actually Bill Shannon, the subject in the Crutch documentary. He actually was a great friend during that time. He came and visited me, I think in part because he really understood what it was to be misunderstood. I think he said that to me, that people with disabilities, the common thing they share is just being misunderstood. And so he was among a few really good friends that were part of that support. My dad was a support, but he's the one kind of who threw me in there. And so there was a lot of, it was fraught, that relationship in that moment. And then actually what it was, and this is another kind of moment that I remember clearly, is remembering how I survived in the rubber walled room. So when you're in a rubber walled room, you're in there because you're a danger to yourself and others, right? And they want to take away all of the sensory stimulation. I mean, it is insane. I know they still do it, but I don't know that it's the best thing to do. You're on like a plastic covered mattress, and you're in a locked room, and there's like a drain there. And, when they first put you in, they put your arms behind you and legs behind you. And there's like, they smush you down and they stab your butt with a tranquilizer. I mean, you're really just treated like an animal. And so with the food, they don't give you forks. They don't give you any utensils because they don't want you to harm yourself. So what I would do is I would make art out of my food. I would just like kind of draw with it or make little, I remember making a smiley face out of my food. I would also rip up my gowns and try to make fashions. I'm sure I just only seemed even more crazy. But I know with that like smiley face, it was like a moment of like, okay, like this is it at my most stripped down, vulnerable place. And, that little delicate vulnerable sprout, in my core, I'm a creator. Like creating and creativity is at my very core, what I need to survive. So I think that was, it was people certainly that helped. And also I did go back to school and getting back into that rhythm. And I did keep playing water polo, and, all of those things helped. But I think it was, really understanding that that's who I was, a creative. I mean, I try to be.
Oh my gosh, you do so much more than try. Wow.
Sorry, it's a lot.
No, it's incredible and so generous, Sachi. I'm so grateful that you're just sharing so generously. Thank you.
Yeah, I never have. I've told my closest friends, but not even really that. Yeah. But it's fine. As you said, Lauren, I think, if it can help someone, it's time. It's worth it, right?
Yeah, I love your boldness into diving into the conversation around mental health and the sort of intergenerational link of processing or not being able to process trauma. And, your experience is one of the outcomes of not being skilled with a toolkit for being able to have the conversations that you're now having with your daughter about what it can mean to be unwell in varying capacities. Your mom was Japanese American, born in a World War II internment camp in Arizona. Your mom went on to call you Sachi, which translates as child of bliss or happiness in Japanese. And I'm interested to know about what role silence around the silencing that you probably experienced in a mental health facility, and then also the realities of the silencing around the internment camps for Japanese Americans. I'm interested to know if those experiences have informed or inspired your commitment to telling story, to drawing story out of your life and your work.
Very much. Yes, very much so. There's a field of study that's relatively new called epigenetics, and it's scientifically showing that trauma from many generations can change your DNA and affect you in various ways. And when I went to the mental hospital, actually, when I was diagnosed, it was a bit of a mystery because my parents were like, we're not great. There was no real documented mental health illness in my family. I mean, there were alcoholics, there were signs, right? But I kind of was like, well, of course, like my grandmother was pregnant with my mom when they were rounded up and lost everything and, put behind barbed wire and living in a horse barrack. And so she was born in the camp. And, when a woman is born, of course, she's born with all the eggs that she'll have for the rest of her life. Right. And so I've often thought that like, well, okay, of course, I was one of those eggs. I was there in the camp too, even though I wasn't born yet. Like all of that experience and trauma affected me, I'm sure. And And then they got out of the camps, and as Japanese, as most of the Japanese Americans did, and as Japanese culture encouraged, it was to ganmansuru, is to just persevere, is to just the nail that sticks up is hammered down, and to, they were in America to be Americans and to be successful, and success was going to, they believed in the American dream, that like, just if they worked hard enough and kept quiet about these injustices, that they would be able to achieve the dream, any of their dreams, right? And in many ways, my mom did. So she had another brother that was born in the camp, and then she had 2 older sisters. So there were 4 of them. My grandfather died shortly after they returned. So it was like a single mother raising 4 kids.
How long were they imprisoned?
4 years. Wow. Yeah, 4 years, the first 4 years of her life. So imagine Manoa, this whole time being behind barbed wire. And then coming back to a very hostile country, a very hostile California. They were in California before, and they came back to California, but nobody would rent to them. They were living in a place with dirt floors, and my grandfather made the bath, outside that was just, they burned wood to heat it, and they were renting land to farm on. And yet my mom ends up becoming, she was valedictorian, homecoming queen, full scholarship to UCLA. All 3 sisters got scholarships to UCLA. And
wow.
Tebo was the black sheep that went to USC. But, so just kind of like she made it, and then she marries this white guy, my dad. He's more than a white guy. But and so it's like carrying on. Okay, we're Americans. It's not that she ever hid that story. My aunt, the one surviving member of my mom's family, the oldest, she was actually really good about telling me that story. So I always knew of that story, but we never processed that story. It was never about like, well, how did that feel? Or like, it was just more like these little bits of, that I just shared now of how hard it was. Mm-hmm. And really more as examples of like how you can overcome anything, right?
But also in that overcoming, there are many unmet needs and, like you said,
exactly.
Unprocessed emotions that live in our bodies, whether we choose to acknowledge 100%. Them or not.
Yeah, 100%. And then then I should say that my mom had breast cancer when I was born, and back then it was before lumpectomies existed. So she had a radical mastectomy. So it's when they cut off your entire breast. And so I always knew her. I mean, actually, my parents it sounds weird when you say you walked around naked, but we did, we weren't ashamed of our body. Like, we weren't ashamed of our bodies. So I was always just, it's like, okay, there's my mom walking around with this she just had this horrific scar. And the truth of the matter, I was like, okay, scars are beautiful. This is who my mom is. My dad also is, only has one eye. One eye's closed. He was born with it closed. And so I certainly knew that like scars are beautiful. Difference is beautiful, but it's also really scary when you're a kid looking at those things and then realizing that those things other people don't have. And then when my mom got ovarian cancer when I was in high school, it was just like, keep on working, keep on studying. It's like, and mom loses her hair and, just all these things that just silence, just carry on. So I guess that's also why I changed in that moment, looking at myself in the mirror. It's just like, there's no running away from this anymore. Like, I got to deal with this. I got to deal with what's happening to me now. I got to like process. I'm an only child. So I kind of feel like sometimes that all of the trauma of my mom's whole family was just like, I inherited all of that, in some ways. I used to spend every summer with my mom's family, living with them and going to Japanese school. And it was really important for my mom, for me to learn that culture. But part of that culture was silence. And so, yes, when I did eventually find journalism and storytelling, it was this outlet for sharing. I actually haven't told the Japanese American story, but others have. but I wanted to, I wanted to make sure that, well, now I teach journalism, and, I just want to give them the gift of storytelling, of them being able to tell their own stories. I think I am attracted to documentary filmmaking because in that medium, people tell they speak in their own voice. They are telling their own stories if you're doing it well. Yeah. So it's very much influenced where I am today.
Mm.
Mm. Speaking of, you alluded to this tradition of working hard, persevering. I was really interested to ask you about when you quit your job at the LA Times and you hit the road for what became a 14-month-long road trip across the Americas, along the Pacific, from LA to Chile. Mm-hmm. Massive undertaking. What inspired that trip in particular, and what role did mental health play in the decision to leave?
Mm-hmm. Mental health was the main reason, actually. Well, procreation was the main reason. My husband and I wanted to have a kid, and we were trying. We were kind of trying. We weren't like stressful trying. I guess having sex is really when it comes down to it. But we were, with the idea that, okay, maybe it's time. We're ready to have a kid, and nothing was happening, but not to a degree that I was really that concerned. But what I did know is, part of what also has made me healthy is medication and talk therapy and, the swimming. I should mention that even during that whole time that I wasn't processing feelings, I was swimming, I was playing the piano, I was a piano player. Like, I did have outlets for my emotions. If I didn't have those things, I don't know where I would be. So there are other ways of, processing emotions in your body, especially, right? So because I was on various medications, I found a psychiatrist that specialized in maternity health and psychiatry. So she worked with women to figure out the best meds to take while they're while they're pregnant. And as a general rule of thumb, healthy mom, healthy baby. And so, yes, some of these drugs have some risks, but they're so minor that the benefits outweigh the risks for the most part. And so by telling this story, I by no means want anyone who is taking psychiatric drugs that work to think they have to get off of them in order to have a baby, because that is not the case. I know many people who have had babies when taking lots of lithium, lots of, so yeah, that's my only concern in telling this story. I don't want anyone to think that. So it's just, my own personal story is that when she was laying out all these risks, it's like those commercials for drugs, where they're like all like happy. And then there's like for a minute of just like all the ways you can die and from this drug. And pretty much I could not get past that. Just any chance that there was any risk that this child was going to be born with a hole in its heart, or I forget all the other things that could have happened. I just knew I couldn't live with myself. I knew this was probably my one shot. I was 38, I think, when we were starting to try. No, I was 37, 38 when we started trying. So, clock was ticking, and it was probably my one shot. So I worked with this doctor to first figure out some alternative. I was taking lithium, was the main drug I was taking. And so to first figure out some alternatives to lithium that might work. And we tried like literally everything that exists, and all of them just had side effects that I couldn't live with. So it was a combination of being at the end of the line with that experimentation. And my husband was also writing. He's a writer, and he also worked as a radio man. He was at NPR, working at NPR when we left. But at that time, he was freelancing. He was one of his jobs was he was writing, he was one of the writers on 180 South, Jeff Johnson's story. Mm-hmm. And so we had all these notes in our office of their journey. And so we kind of had it mapped out in our office. So that was certainly, on our mind. And we went surfing we were living in Silver Lake, which is near downtown. It's very far from the ocean. To drive to the beach, we drove like LA traffic, like an hour and a half to a crappy day of surf on like, the one time I had surfed in a month or something. And I was just like, it was a shitty session. And I was just like, I just want 1 year where all I do is surf. And it's just kind of hung in the air. And then I'm just like, wait a minute. If I'm having all these troubles I'm not finding medication that I like, fuck it. I'll just go off of the medication. But I also knew how much I needed that medication. And so if I was off of the medication, I was like, I can't have a job as stressful as mine was at the LA Times. Yeah, I can't just have a stressful job like that. And I need to be in the ocean every day, like, period. Like, I need to figure out a way I have to be in the ocean every day. So, Zach's my husband. We talked about this and we're just like, I don't know, just one thing led to another. We had a little money saved that ostensibly was to start this family of ours, but, maybe buy a house someday or whatever, but it was certainly nowhere close to that. But it was enough to buy a truck and a little, we had a flip pack, which is this like, it's flat and flips over and turns your car into like a tent where you sleep over the top. And and so we planned what ended up being a 14-month trip across the Americas along the Pacific coast.
Wow. I'm really curious about that feeling of setting off, and if you felt like that little sprout again when doing that, if that was a especially nerve-wracking time to change so much, to change career, to change medication, to drop it and to hit the road. Was that an especially vulnerable time for you?
Yeah, I don't know if vulnerable is the right word because, I think when you lose a parent young, one of the first things you learn is that, to go for it. Life is short. And so I feel like I was already taking some of those moves towards following my passion, following my dream. But we quit dream jobs. I mean, we met at graduate school for journalism, and that was it. Like, I was at the LA Times doing video and photo. Like, it still is, one of the best jobs I've ever had. It's an amazing job to be a journalist. Zach was at NPR. Like, we were living the dream, but we weren't, right? So it was scary. It was definitely scary. It was just like, what the heck? Yeah. If we stayed here, like, we're living the dream, and this is someday we'll be winning Pulitzers or whatever, but again, that's, I guess in the back of my mind, I also kind of recognized that would be going back to the old Sachi, who was like getting straight A's so that she could get into the best college and, just like achieve, goal, rather than throwing myself into chaos, which is partly what I love about journalism and filmmaking and the ocean. Obviously, all three of those are like environments that you thrive on chaos and finding your own path. And I guess in many ways with these full-time jobs, it was becoming more like rigid and more, what's the word? I mean, we knew what tomorrow would bring,
That rigidity can feel so contagious when your life is so structured. I feel like, I don't know, I can't help but start to internalize that rigidity. And that's where the ocean is so good at turning us inside out and breaking down the internal rigidities that we build up.
And I mean, there also is a lot too. I wanted to, before I forgot, is that part of that journey. I don't think we realized it at the time, but have you read the book Blue Mind by Jay Nichols? And so he's a friend. And when we spoke at one of Jay's Blue Mind conferences, and it was about this trip, and my husband put it very eloquently, which I won't right now, but describing that trip, really what it was about also was just us being in the water together. It was like us being in that same flow together, right? Which is so hard when you have these stressful jobs, that you're only seeing each other for a little bit every day, and ships in the night. And yeah, and so that's a really tough place to be creating another human out of, right? Or it was for us anyhow.
Definitely. Well, what fertile grounds to lay to choose to be in the flow of daily life together. And I'm wondering about the transition. What was that transition life from such fast pace to really owning all of your time day after day, month after month?
Well, it wasn't always easy. I remember meeting this person along the way that I told her our plan, and I quit my job so I could be in this relaxed environment. She's like, but you chose something really stressful to do, like to go on a road trip and like not know what every day brings is also can be stressful, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we were held up at gunpoint once and in Nicaragua, and there were all these things. We also, I should say, I was, again, going back to the rigidity. I was doing this whole thing of taking my temperature and just
basal body temperature for fertility.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to know. I'm glad I learned about all that stuff because it is obviously important, but it was becoming that like rigidity. And of course, it didn't happen until we got to Peru, and it was like hadn't happened yet. And I was just like, screw it. Like, I'm going to start smoking weed again, and I'm going to and I'm not going to take my temperature anymore. And so then it happened. It actually happened when I had gotten a call back for this job I have now teaching, and I had flown back, done the interview, come back. I also like to think where we were in Peru is where the last of the Pacific Northwest swells end. And so, before this trip, I had just finished this video series, Chasing the Swell, about guys chasing swells from Hawaii to Mavericks to Todos. But that keeps going, right? That swell keeps going. And the very last place it hits is where NAMI was made. Maybe too much information, but I think there was some magic to that I was like, the energy was like, when an energy and when you're like frothing and the energy just kind of like infects you, and you're then concentrating on that and not on. So I feel like, okay, it's the calm of like, we're at the end of the swell, end of the road, time to create again.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you said the word magic there, Sachi, because I couldn't help but noticing in a couple of the movie pieces that you've put together, magic is a word that pops up. And I was curious to know how you define that word, because I've heard you say that on screen, and then also in Crutch there's a couple moments where that word's spoken. I was just wondering if you have a go-to explanation or moment
of what magic is.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah. I mean, magic for me is when the universe, just all things come together. I mean, it could be while you're riding on a wave and, you're in a barrel in the most extreme sense, but you're riding. It's certainly, surfing is something we all love because it's this portal to magic, right? Every time you go out. But in life, I think it's just when it's kind of like right place, right time kind of moments that you never could have dreamt of, and they just happen. I think that's what I love about photography and documentary filmmaking as well, is that when those moments happen. Like I'm filming and there's not all of what I film is magic, but when it happens, you're just like, you get goosebumps and like, you just know that something special happened. Right. So it's both. It can't be said in words. I don't think magic. It's a feeling. It's an energy that like, it's kind of like energies come together and it's like forms their own energy that is like special for you, right? Special for, it can be special for people. It can be like a concert. There can be magic, or a session with your friends, that it can be that shared magic. But it's just that. I know it's raw audio though, so I hopefully just That's it.
That's right. Well, that what you just did then, that is the sound and the motion of the peak moment in the ocean with waves, and that when you're swimming in that on the shoulder at OB and you're watching a wave come towards you and it's been inhaling the whole time and then it exhales and you watch all of those little drops of water shower into the sky around you, and the same thing, it detonates at Mavericks and all of a sudden there's like an upside down waterfall going into the sky. It's like, that those moments are magical and they're fleeting and they pass. And I've noticed that in your work and in some of the things you speak about, that magic happening in the water and how you then perhaps bring that to your terrestrial life, your life back here on land with other humans and situations. How, when you talk about surf therapy and you speak of those things, was that something that someone illuminated for you, that there's things you can learn in the water and then bring back to your land life? Or has that been something that you've just sort of cultivated over the years yourself?
Yeah, I think I've cultivated it over the years. I mean, so I for these 2 weeks every year, I would go and be in the ocean. And even those times, I remember the magic of riding a wave on my raft. And I remember the magic of surviving. There's this older lifeguard that stayed in the house, a female lifeguard that stayed in the house next to us all the time. And she would take me out in the water. She really taught me so much about surviving. And the survival was magic, to be able to see this huge wave and be like, dive under it. And then you come up unscathed. You're like, that's magic, right? But in terms of the magic, and it's just, isn't that what's so, it blows my mind how much magic is in surfing and how many lessons there are to be learned from surfing. It's endless, right? You're just like, they're so profound. They're so simple, yet so profound. I mean, I think I have one every time I go out.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I mean, even today when I was swimming, it was a crappy day. It was a big, burly, like ugly day of surf. And the skies were gray from the smoke. But when it's big like that, of course, there's lots of whitewater. And so often I was just surrounded by foam and all I could see was foam. And it was reflecting the sky. And it was like it was like being in a light box. In San Francisco, we have, in the summer, it's terrible. Like there's no sun. We go for months without any sun. And I was like, of course, like this is my sun. This is why I go out here. Like I get these rays of foam that are my light. And and maybe that's part of the big waves, bigger waves, bigger foam, more light, more magic.
I like that. I like that equation. Speaking of being out in big surf, Sachi, you're one of the few photographers in general, but one of the very few female photographers who swim in heavy water and are really committed to chasing and documenting big waves. I'm really curious about what led you into that realm of great consequence.
A large part was just living in Northern California. When I first moved here, I was from LA. It was to move in with a boyfriend at the time who was a big wave surfer. And so I was around it. He would go out in big waves at Ocean Beach and at Mavericks, and all of his friends were, heavy chargers. And so, so I was familiar with it. At that point, I wasn't really, I didn't really know how to surf. So, I mean, I only learned how to surf on a board, like when I was 20 something, 22, 23. I mean, so that's why, because I just haven't, at this point that means I've been doing it for 25 years. You wouldn't know it if you saw me surfing, but but I really wanted to go out in those waves, but I had no business being in those waves on my surfboard. But I knew that I would just I'd be that girlfriend in the parking lot, and I was just like, this is not who I am. I am not the girlfriend in the parking lot watching my boyfriend surf. And I, one of the first times I was up here in San Francisco at Ocean Beach, I was looking out at the water, and I was using his binoculars in the car, and I saw this little orange cap bobbing in the water. And I was like, I think that's a body surfer. And then I looked closer, and I was like, I think that's a woman. And so just like seeing it, if you see it, you can be it. Just like seeing that woman out there, her name's Judith Sheridan. She's a legend. And I was like, I can do that too. Like, I'm a swimmer. I know how to body surf. I don't know how to surf these waves, but I know I can swim in them. And actually, to backtrack, when I was in Indonesia, in 1997, this was after, anyhow, when I was there, it was the same thing. I didn't know how to surf. At that point, I was really embarrassed that I didn't know how to surf. So I actually I don't even think I told anyone. I was just like, I like body surfing. Like, that's my thing. But I knew I could get out. Like, I always could survive out. I knew my way around the water swimming. So that first venture out, Judith, I swam right up to Judith and started chatting. And she's like, do you know what you're doing? Kind of thing. And she just told me all of the things I needed to look for when I'm diving under the wave, and basically how to survive and thrive out there. And so she gave me the tickets. She opened the door to being out in bigger surf. I actually also had I'm trying to remember if it was before I came to Ocean Beach. I had a few seminal experiences. I was in Hawaii. It was after I got back from Indonesia, and I went with some friends that I had met in Indonesia to watch the HIC, what was called the HIC Pro back then at Pipeline. And I was just naive and went out on this day that was, it was building from like 4 feet to 14 feet in like 4 hours. It was just like this giant incoming swell, west swell. And everyone just kept peeling out, leaving the lineup, shooting. And then all of a sudden it was just me and Mike Prickett and Larry Haynes. And I was just this kid from Pittsburgh who like had no business being there. But I was just like, ignorance is bliss, right? And so they were both looking at me like, they're like, do you know what you're doing? Do you know, like, these are big waves. And they also gave me some tips. But I had those experiences, so I had the confidence that that moment I was going to tell you about in Indonesia, that was a really big swell, I think. Even now, I think back, I think it was pretty big. And so I knew I could, I knew I loved it. Those were like at that point, those were those life-changing moments. Those were like, okay, big surf, big energy, big Sachi, like big me. I can just, this is it. This is what I'm here on earth to do. So there's just lots of opportunities to do that. And at Ocean Beach and then at Mavericks. Yeah. And eventually there were women that popped up in the lineup too. And so, yeah.
I actually really want to paint more of a picture for people who don't swim in bigger surf or haven't been in waves of consequence, which is a lot of us. And there's this thing that happens like when you're in the water, in bigger waves, where if you break your leg rope and you're all of a sudden swimming and you don't have a board, you realize you can't see much, and you realize that you've been relying on your sight a lot as a surfer on a board, where you can go over a swell and sit up on your board quickly and look far out to see if there's a set coming, and or your markers on land, or various things that help you have positioning in the lineup that keeps your mental state calm and collected. But when you swim and you're in waves like that, a lot of the time you don't have as much of a visual guide for what's happening. And so there's this added layer of trust in your other senses. This is, for me, this is what I've felt in bigger waves where I like to swim as well occasionally. And that you start relying on how the water around you feels, if it's hard, if you're paddling against or swimming against a current and so the water feels hard, or if it's a bit softer and all of a sudden you're being pulled with it, or turbulence in that water, whatever it is. There's other senses that kick in, but also there's almost like more trust that needs to kick in in your abilities to stay calm, in your understanding of where you are in the lineup. And these are things that, unless you've swum in spaces like that, you probably are not that aware of. But you, I would imagine, would be very acutely aware of how water feels, and that you can't just rely upon your visuals. There's a lot of other faculties to call on. Has that been your experience? And is that something that's part of the swimming experience at places like Ocean Beach, where there isn't a channel and you have to swim through the chaos to get out to the calm behind all those waves?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you were talking about the lack of visuals, I was thinking about when you're swimming at Mavericks and you see all of those guys and women, paddling, scraping for something. You don't know what it is yet, but you just see like people just paddling their, just as hard as they can. And you're just like further deeper than them. And you're just like, fuck, okay, well, I can't paddle that fast. I'm not going to get to where they are. So I'm just going to have to deal with whatever comes. But again, I think that's what I am there for. That's what is the attraction, right? Is, and then the same with journalism or whatever, is just like the unknown. Just venturing into the unknown is the thrill and joy and practice, really. It is a practice for me as well, because it, then applies to other parts of my life. But I don't think I answered your question. Oh, the feeling. I think a lot of the feeling is because of all those years swimming. So you were a competitive swimmer as well. Were both of you competitive swimmers? You were?
I wasn't.
Dave?
This is pretty unfamiliar territory for me.
I was growing up a lot of ocean swimming and pool swimming. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like when you don't swim for a while and you feel like you lose that feeling of the water, right? Have you what I'm talking about? Like, luckily I haven't had that feeling for a very long time, but I think it's that really, really was so important that I had that confidence of what it feels like to propel yourself forward with your legs and with your hands. I was a butterflyer, and I really do think a lot of my confidence in the water comes from a strong dolphin kick, because I'm going sideways like a shark kind of, and not really like, but so I kind of use it's that. And so just knowing I have that power and know what that power feels like, I think that gives me a certain confidence in feeling my way around the ocean. But it's a constant learning process. Like, I'm still learning that. I feel very confident at Ocean Beach now. Like, it's a long, luckily I've also been going back to the same place. So, so Ocean Beach has really become, I just know it really well. Mavericks, I'm starting to get to know really well. And it is that part of it is that it's just that feeling of moving through. I don't know if I answered your question though.
No, beautiful. I didn't really I was probably waffling on myself, but I just love when we who get to experience things in the ocean that very few people get to experience. I love hearing people talk about that, because it's all of a sudden bringing us into the lineup and getting a glimpse of how a pretty rare space feels, and how magical it is, and how, like you said, Mark Healy talks of the sparkly eye factor of big wave surfers, and what it is about those spaces that gives us that twinkle in the eye.
I was just watching the two of you, and I would call it a little bit more than sparkle in this conversation. I was watching you both, like your eyes dilating, just like
activate.
Apologies for the interruption, but we'd like to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who help make this podcast possible. The Water People podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. In 1997, founder Jeff Kelly started out with one simple goal: to make people smile and to encourage them to pass it on. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades, while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks to Sanuk for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com.
Thanks to Gary McNeil Concepts, who put together cosmic boards for cosmic people.
Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to garymcneilconcepts.com.
Before researching for our chat today, I was most familiar with your work as it relates to documenting women in big waves and in the surf through your Patagonia short, Voices for the Ocean, and also your forthcoming film, She Change, which features big wave surfers Bianca Valenti, Calla Kenley, Andrea Muller, and Paige Alms, and really illustrates their stand for pay equity and wave access equity in the big wave arena. I feel like their work and also your work in pushing surfing toward gender pay equity at the highest competitive levels has really been underappreciated within surf culture itself, which I think tends to be the case with women's surfing, that it's highly covered in mainstream media, but less so in endemic outlets. But my sense is that the WSL gets a lot of credit for their, quote, decision to honor equal pay for equal work. And I was wondering, Sachi, if you could help flesh out the reality of the legwork that went into putting that decision on the table in the first place.
Yes. So it was ultimately a decision that they made to create equal pay, and it was a decision to be on the right side of history. And so I have to give them credit for that because, you know, I don't know if you've seen this documentary LFG about the women's soccer team, national team trying to get equal pay, and they have not yet. So it is a very big deal that they made that decision. There was the big wave women. I think what they were successful at doing is putting it was the big wave women, and it was also this woman Sabrina Brennan, who was a harbor commissioner at the time and is an activist, and she really started this push. She's not a surfer, her partner is, but she was at a California Coastal Commission meeting, and so the California Coastal Commission is unique to California, and it's a governing body that ensures equal access to the coast. And she was at this meeting. She lives near Mavericks, so she knew about Mavericks and knew about the contest. And they were deciding whether or not to give a multi-year permit for this contest. And all she knew was that there weren't any women in the contest. So she was just like, why aren't there, you know, any surfer, anybody in the mainstream surfing world would be like, well, of course there's no women because the women don't surf or like, you know, there are no, so it's just like anyone who was surfing would not have raised that question, I don't think, but she was just like, why aren't there women? And if this governing body, the California Coastal Commission, is meant to protect equal access to the coast, well, isn't this an issue of access? Because the Mavericks contest there's only one permit issued per year by the California Coastal Commission to have a contest. And so they have this hold on that area. Nobody else can use it except the contestants. And so if all of those contestants are men, then you're not providing equal access to the coast. And so, so she kind of started the ball rolling with all of that. She needed some stakeholders, and I got wind of this meeting that she had with the CCC and this guy, Mark Massara, who's a kind of legendary coastal lawyer. He's also my neighbor. And you know his work?
Yeah, I do,
yeah. So have you met him?
I think I have, once when I passed through Ocean Beach. Long time
you've been
ago.
there. You have been here. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that later. But he messaged me and was like, did you see what happened? And do you know who this woman is? And I didn't. I listened and I contacted her immediately. And I was like, you have to meet these four women. Because at that point, we had already met at this invitational event for women at Mavericks that a woman named Nico Sal put together. So like, I knew that there were these stakeholders. I was already like wanting to make a film about these women. And I had already focused on these four because they were just a friend group that kind of coalesced naturally. and they were also just the best. And so really that was what I was just interested in documenting them, because I knew I had been following big wave surfing at that point for, almost 10 years at that point. No, longer. Well, anyhow, I had been covering big wave surfing for 10 years at that point. So I knew that what these women were doing was very unique and rare. It was only guys that I was seeing in the water. Not only there were, a few people, Sarah Gearhart is one of them who was doing it, long before any of this, but, I just wanted to document them because what they were doing was awesome. And I knew that any Joe Schmo watching this who knew nothing about surfing would watch these women going down these giant waves, and it would be impossible, I think, for that person, especially a man, to not have their perception of what a woman is capable of doing completely change. Just the simple act of seeing a photo or video of these women doing that. So that was kind of my interest when I started. But then there was this political action happening, and this group of women joined Sabrina and a lawyer, and they created the Committee for Equity in Women Surfing. And so the story just kept getting better and better, right? But it really came to a head when they successfully got a women's heat at the Mavericks competition, but then they did the unthinkable, and they asked also for equal pay. And I witnessed how much shit they got from every single angle. From the people that were closest to them to everywhere. We're just like, are you crazy? How dare you kind of attitude of like, we gave you this opportunity to surf in this contest and now you want equal pay. There's only 12 of you and there's 100 of these guys. And why should you get paid equal to them when everyone just thought it was preposterous to be asking for that. Of course, anyone who's not a surfer and who, I remember, I think it was Gail King on this CBS news show, the banter of the hosts beforehand. She was like, hello, it's 2020, or I think it's 2016 then. She was like, hello, did you know it's 2016? Like women are supposed to get paid the same as men. But you know what the surfing world is like as far as change goes, and as far as the male domination of the sport still is. So they were getting pressure from everywhere, but definitely also from the WSL, who was, saying that we can't afford to pay you. And they were like, okay, well, they brought it to a head. It was like, okay, well, if you can't pay us, then we are not going to compete, which means the CCC isn't going to let you have a contest. So, it's kind of a perfect storm of like, if you don't pay us equally, you can't have a contest.
It was bold
fantastic.
Political strategy. And I just want to, just to emphasize how bold the big wave surfers involved were. They were demanding what women who have been surfing on the WSL ASP tour probably have been asking for inside their own heads, but had never successfully organized and pushed for in such a focused and overt way with real consequences, like stepping away from competition. It really was a radical move in the context of surf culture.
Yeah. And for me, I think the attraction, to go back to one of your original questions, is I got into the business of storytelling because I wanted to tell these untold stories. And I was the only one following these women. Like nobody else I know, because I was there, like nobody else was there. And so a lot of the impetus remains, like, I don't want these women's story to be forgotten. And, for whatever the WSL and whoever wants to say of how it really went down, to bury that story, and also, I'm glad you mentioned the boldness. Like, I think also a large part of my attraction to what these women did is it was just the opposite of what the Japanese Americans did. Like, I was raised and still fight this culture. And I think it's kind of Asian American culture. It's a female cultural thing to just be quiet to lay down, to not raise your voice, not ask for what you want, be happy with what you got, that has been so drilled into me. And to see these 4 women being like, I don't care. This is what I want. Like, this is what is right. And this is what you need to do. And if means we don't compete, then we don't compete. It was just like, oh my God, are you really saying that?
They were putting their careers on the line, each of them.
Completely. I mean, it was not the 4 of them just because it was this exclusive club. They tried to get every single other big wave woman to join the Committee for Equity of Women Surfing. Those were the only 4 women that were willing to put their career on the line. So it was no small feat. And
Sachi, as you were alluding to, yours is an incredibly rare female voice amongst surf storytellers. And I'm curious to know how the experience of working with and around the Boys Club of Surfing has been for you as a photographer, as a writer, and a filmmaker.
In some ways, I think because I didn't grow up, I mean, I've never was part of, I wouldn't have been part of the Boys Club anyhow, but because I was really not part of any surf culture growing up, I think that kind of helped. I came into the surf culture knowing I was an outsider, being very aware that I was an outsider. But I think I used that to my advantage in some ways, not even knowingly. Most of the time, I'm just naive. But I mean, how has it been dealing with sexist culture, basically, is what you're saying? Well, that's why I'm in it, to change it. I don't know. That's what drives me. And then, I feel like things, especially with social media, things are like changing so much more rapidly. There's like, oh, it's not just one lone voice, and, what you're doing and your work, and Crystal, and, all of these women who are saying, it doesn't, I guess it's just this, I mean, and even you asking Taylor Steele, like, why no women until now? Like, I would never have the nerve to ask something like that, and when you were saying, like, his films are great, but I loved how, Lauren, you were just like, yeah, well, they were you're just kind of like, it wasn't really what I was doing. We're like, and I think, as we just got to break it down. It's just little photo by photo, bit by bit. It's happening. I feel like it's really, and this podcast as well, just giving voice and to those stories.
I totally hear you on that. I'm right there with you, but I feel like and we live in a world where young women and men and lots of people feel like we're in a, post feminist reality where gender bias and gender privilege maybe isn't as powerful. Well, it isn't probably, but isn't still a powerful force in preventing stories or shaping careers. I was just wondering if you had any particular experiences working within the surf industry that would be funny or frustrating or worth sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still not part of the Boys Club. I'm still not getting asked to go on surf trips to shoot the boys. Would you want to? Sure. Yeah, of course. That's the only way we're going to get to this. You said it. I have it here somewhere. You said it so well in your article in Surfing World of, we are heading towards this world where hopefully this difference isn't so pronounced between genders. But I mean, all these women, when I'm still trying to get this film funded. But when I started, the guys are just like, can't you just ask their sponsors? And I'm like, well, they don't have sponsors. And, this is now, like there's pages sponsored now. And I don't think we're in a post feminist world. But I was on the phone this morning with Louis Cejoyos, who Dave, and have you met also,
No,
Lauren?
No.
And he is a force, as you know, and he came on as an executive producer a few years ago, 3 years ago now, and he told me today what he told me then, is that this is a great story. And I think it really has the potential to make money. I mean, he's like, it's got everything. It's got, and yeah. And it's just like, it's been 6 years now. It's never been fully funded. I actually vowed after making Crutch, they would never make a film that wasn't fully funded up front. But then I just like found myself swimming in the water at Mavericks when these women were all together. And that was the first time I had swum at Mavericks, actually. And yeah, it's just like, oh shit. Like, like I can't. It's just like, here it is. Like, it's the culmination of everything. My 10 years of working in the big wave world and my swimming and all of it. It was just like, okay, this is the story of my career. And so I have followed it, as best I can with no budget. And when I started working with Louis, he took one look at my budget and was just like, what is this? Like, I mean, I wasn't paying myself. I wasn't paying, like, it was just assuming all of this sweat equity. And he's just like, no, he's like, if you want to compete against the boys, you have to have the same budget as the boys. And he's 100% right. The only problem is I'm not a boy. And so it's just not as easy to get funding.
Yeah. I found that too.
It was magic that I was placed in that water at that moment and meeting those women that day was magic. Like all of us, it was electric. When we were on the boat coming back, it was Paige and KK and Bianca and Andrea. And we were just like, there were 12 women in the lineup at Mavericks. Like that had never happened before and hasn't happened since. We just knew that something really magic and special had happened. So, I'd like that to buoy me forward rather than the meh.
Speaking of magic, when you and Dave both were speaking about the sensations of swimming in big surf, I was watching both of your eyes get bigger and bigger and the energy rising in your bodies. And it made me curious about the relationship between mental stability, mental fortitude, mental instability, managing fear, and big surf. Like, what's the relationship between what's going on in our internal ocean and what's happening?
Yeah, I'm curious. Thank you, Lauren, for this prompt, because this is something I'm interested to hear what you think about, Sachi. Have you noticed any radical differences in sort of personality or temperament with the women in those big wave lineups and the men? Do you feel like there's something different that the women embody on those days leading up to or afterward that is just different to the men?
Well, there's a few things that are going through my mind. One is actually that lesson. You were asking some of the lessons learned from surfing. And I think the big wave women in particular, when you're in a lineup with other women, I mean, I hate to say it, but I see it all the time. And I see it in myself, is this hesitation to drop in. But after being around big wave surfers, but particularly being around these women, it was just like, I just have them in my mind when I'm at the top of a big wave now. I'm just like, fucking go for it. Like, just like Belinda said it in my ocean film, that, don't hesitate, that never hesitate, just, have to go for it. Dedicate, don't hesitate is what Bianca likes to say. Dedicate, don't hesitate. So in that sense, I feel like the really critical thing you need to have is the mental fortitude or the craziness to drop down this sheer cliff of water. At the end of the day, it's really that moment of like deciding to go down, really, that I think the women have in the same way as the men, and that I just find completely awesome and inspiring. What I see different in the women is that they're just smarter about how they go about it. Yeah, you have to take risks in big wave surfing, but I don't think that the greater the risk, the greater reward is necessarily always the case, right? And I think they know that too. And so I think they're actually changing the culture of big wave surfing in some ways because of that. I know I personally am going for the long game. So I might not get the gnarliest shot at the gnarliest time, but I'm going home to have dinner with my family and snuggle with my daughter. And yeah. And so I guess on the one hand, you could look at that, some guy or anyone could look at that and be like, oh, they're just like a wimp, or they're just not gnarly enough, or they're not going for it. But I think they're actually smarter and more calculated. And I think that's the main difference I see. But, KK on that, for KK, like there's certain people like her. I think I've heard Shane Dorian is kind of the same, that they are just competitors to the core. And of course, KK grew up with the Rat Pack and just with that, knowing how to operate in that world. And so I guess she kind of like barks at people and like really scares. She plays the like intimidation game and stuff. But then she'll like come back and like, I was so nervous about meeting KK because in Pittsburgh, I still did get the surfing magazines. And so KK was like the one woman that was like, that shot of her at Chopu, you were just like, oh yeah, oh my God, like game changer, right?
Yeah.
And so when I met her, I was just like, oh, and she just like immediately hugs me. And she's just the sweetest, nicest person. But in the water, it's a different story.
Oh, yeah.
Sachi, you've said that there's a reason people enjoy being pinned to the bottom of the ocean and willingly throw themselves into a liquid car crash, that there's always a reason. What's yours?
Well, I think we've gone through it. I think I mentioned it as being a practice, and life has thrown me these car crashes of sorts. Life threw my mom car crashes, like threw my dad a car crash with, being born with one eye. Ultimately, we're all faced with these car crashes. I think I've found that little sprout and light of learning how to find the magic and the light from those dark places by this practice over and over again of facing this wall of water that, you don't know you can't see what's coming. You don't know what's coming for you, but you know that it could kill you. It's scary and dangerous, but in that moment, you just have to remember, that little sprout in yourself for those many years of the magic on the water. And you just have to stay calm in those moments and turn the experience into something magic. And so doing that over and over again, I know is why when I was diagnosed myself with cancer, it was just like, I got this, like, no problem. This is exactly cancer. I think specifically is also living through my mom's cancer. It's I think what's common in all people that have cancer is you never know what's coming next. That's the hardest part. If you have a terminal diagnosis, you're going to die, but you don't know when. It could be 3 weeks. It could be 4 years. So it's that always unknowing. Being in that unknowing place can be really unsettling, of course, right? So I know that big wave surfing, swimming in big waves, has allowed me to constantly be in this place of total chaos and unsettledness, but be settled in myself, learning how to figure out how to be settled in myself in those moments, so I just try to bring that onto land. Don't always do it. I have a mind that has other ideas at times, and I have, who knows what's going to come at us, but I feel prepared.
Thanks to Sachi for her always powerful story sharing. Many thanks also to our sound engineer and editor, Shannon Soul Carroll. The podcast soundtracks are composed by Shannon with additional music by Band of Frequencies. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thanks for making the time to listen with us today. If you have a spare moment, please consider leaving a review of the podcast or sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us to find the very best stories from our global community of water people. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.